Welcome to this episode of Earth Spheres for the dystopian future housing topic. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the Earth spheres and how they link to one another, and you should be able to describe the basic properties and components that make up each of the spheres covered in this lesson. First, we're going to look at the Geosphere and the Biosphere.
Earth is kind of like a puzzle. And I don't mean a puzzle like, where did my brother put my hairbrush? Or what exactly is in the tacos they serve on Taco Tuesday? I mean that our planet is made up of 4 very different parts that all work together to make Earth the lovely place that we know it to be. We call these parts spheres, and between them, they contain all the stuff on our planet. Everything from the fish in the ocean to the air we breathe. Earth has 4 spheres: the Geosphere, the Biosphere, the Hydrosphere, and the Atmosphere. So what exactly are the spheres, and what's in them? Let's take a look at 2, the Geosphere and the Biosphere. Up first is the Geosphere. Geo comes from the Greek word for ground. You may have heard this before in words like geology or geography. It basically means having to do with the Earth. And in a way, the Geosphere is kind of like the skeleton of our planet. All of the other spheres are built on top of it. It's made up of all the rocks and minerals on Earth, from the biggest boulders to the tiniest grains of sand. And all of the landforms that those rocks and minerals make up are part of the Geosphere too. I'm talking volcanoes, canyons, beaches, mountains, you name it. If it's made out of solid Earth, it's part of the Geosphere. Now, it's important to remember that the Geosphere includes only non-living stuff. Living things do need to eat though, and all living things are part of another one of Earth's spheres, the Biosphere. Bio is Greek for life, and like geo, you've probably heard it before in words like biology, the study of life. The Biosphere is made up of many different biomes. Biomes are regions that have similar kinds of plants, animals, and other living things that have adapted to live in that particular region's terrain and climate. Deserts and forests are types of biomes. So are rainforest, grasslands, and wetlands. All of these biomes and many more make up the Biosphere. Okay, now that we know what's in these 2 spheres, let's put them together and try to figure out what belongs to which sphere. Imagine a lovely forest meadow, a bird perched on a rock chirping away, a deer standing in the tall grass, a mountain standing tall in the background, and a stream flowing through the clearing. I can almost smell it. Almost everything in this scene is part of either the Geosphere or the Biosphere. Let's see if we can figure out which parts go into which sphere. Let's start with the Geosphere. We know that there's nothing alive in the Geosphere, so we can rule out all the plants and animals. Water is also part of a different sphere, but we'll talk about that later. When we take away the living things, we're left with all the solid Earth parts of the scene. The rock the bird was standing on, the soil the grass was growing out of, the mountain in the distance, and the bed the stream water flowed through. So what we're left with is the Geosphere. Rocks, soils, and landforms. Got it? Now let's think about the Biosphere. Unlike the Geosphere, everything in the Biosphere is alive. So the rocks, the mountain, and the stream, they don't count. Now we're just left with the living things, the grass, the birds, the deer. Voila! You found the Biosphere.
The Geosphere is the solid Earth that includes the continental and the ocean crust, as well as the various layers of the Earth. 94% of the Earth is composed of the elements oxygen, silicon, and magnesium, so they are heavily or readily abundant materials on Earth. And it's important to know that the Geosphere is not static, and static is a word for unchanging or stationary. It's actually in a constant state of motion, and this is where it links in with things like your tectonic plates and the fact that the center of the Earth is liquid and it's moving around. That's where we get this moving crust component, or this moving sphere component. Looking at the Geosphere's layers, we've got the crust, which is the 0 to 100 kilometers deep layer over here in blue. We've got the mantle, which is 100 to 2,900 kilometers. The outer core is then 2,900 all the way down to 5,100 kilometers below the surface. And the inner core is the 5,100 all the way down to the center of the Earth at 6,378 kilometers. So you're not expected to know these depths or anything like that. Just know the layers of the Geosphere, the layers of the Earth, and we'll talk about what we can find on the Geosphere. The geosphere contains some of the most spectacular sights on Earth. Things like huge volcanoes, the Grand Canyon being one of the most famous places in the world. These are all parts of the geosphere. We've got mountainous ranges. Again, this is all just rocky terrain that's been eroded by rivers. And if we want to consider the layers of the Earth that we've talked about, how far do you think we've actually gotten into the layer of the Earth or into the depth of the Earth? So I wanted to have just a quick think and come up with a number in kilometers of how deep you think you've gotten. A lot of responses that I've seen on this are in the vicinity of something like 10 to 100 kilometers. In fact, the deepest mine in the world, which is in South Africa, is actually just below 4 kilometers. I think it's actually slightly more than that now, but it's at about 4 kilometers. And in order to do that, it involves a huge amount of engineering. There's massive fans underground to push cool air through, and the average temperature of the mine is somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees. So even just getting 4 kilometers down, the heat of the Earth suddenly increases quite rapidly. And so we've actually barely scratched the surface of the crust way up here, and we're certainly a long way from getting anywhere near things like the mantle or the outer core. Next, we're looking at the biosphere. And the biosphere is what we can think of the life zone of the Earth. So all of the living organisms. This includes humans and organic matter that is yet to decompose in the soil. So all of our bacteria and things like that are all part of the biosphere. The biosphere is made up of something known as the food chain. And we've hopefully seen this before. And this is where we have the different tiers of the food chain, where the plants are the primary producer. The thing that eats them is your primary consumer, which is always your herbivore. And then it follows on different levels from that to your carnivores, all the way up to the decomposers, which are the things that break down the organisms once they die. And that links back in with our cycles that we'll talk about in a later lesson.
Remember when we were putting together the puzzle that is our planet, using the 4 spheres as giant pieces? Well, we got pretty far last time, but we're not done yet. Oh no. That's because, in addition to the geosphere and the biosphere, which we talked about last time, there are 2 more spheres that we need to complete our planetary puzzle. Those are the hydrosphere and the atmosphere. So without further ado, let's dive in. See what I did there? I said that because the first sphere we're going to talk about is the hydrosphere. Hydro comes from the Greek word for water, and all of the water on Earth is in the hydrosphere. This means that every single drop of salt water in the oceans, but also all of the fresh water in lakes and rivers, is in this sphere. And it includes all of the water trapped in glaciers as ice, and the water held deep underground. Now, there's also water in the air around us, too, which we can sometimes see in the form of rain and snow. Those things come from clouds, which happen to be way up in the atmosphere. Our last, but certainly not least, sphere. This sphere contains all of the gases on the planet, which is fitting since atmos comes from the Greek word for air. Although we can't really see the atmosphere or grab onto it, it reaches everywhere and covers the entire planet like a giant snuggly blanket. But our atmosphere blanket isn't all the same. It's split up into many different layers. The troposphere is the lowest layer. It contains 80% of the air on the planet. It's also where all of our weather takes place. Above the troposphere is the stratosphere. There's no weather up there and much less air, but there's still important gases in it that help absorb harmful rays from the sun. The mesosphere is the coldest layer of the atmosphere and sits on top of the stratosphere. There's almost no breathable air up there, and even less in the thermosphere above it, where you might bump into some satellites flying around the planet. The last layer of the atmosphere is the exosphere. That's the highest you can go and still be on Earth. Once you leave the exosphere, you're officially in space, baby. Now, these 2 spheres can be kind of hard to tell apart, so let's investigate. At the beach. The beach is the perfect place to take a closer look at what pieces of our environment make up the hydrosphere and which are parts of the atmosphere. The beach is, of course, right next to the ocean, and since the ocean holds most of the water on our planet, it's the biggest part of the hydrosphere. The rivers that flow into the ocean are also a big part. And so is the rain that's just starting to fall on our beach. Well, that's a bummer, but check this out. While the rain is a part of the hydrosphere, the clouds it came from are actually part of the atmosphere, and the wind that pushes the waves around is part of the atmosphere too. Even though we can't see it, the atmosphere is all around us in the form of the air that we breathe.
The hydrosphere contains all of the water found on our planet. This includes things like the lakes, the oceans, rivers, streams, and creeks, and any of the water that's trapped underground or in the groundwater. It also includes water vapor that's in the atmosphere once it's evaporated. Frozen water in the ice caps and the glaciers are also part of the hydrosphere, and this is sometimes referred to as the cryosphere, as in the frozen component of the hydrosphere. But for our content, we're just considering it as part of the hydrosphere. It's interesting to note that 3% of water on Earth is actually fresh, so only 3%. And of that 3%, 70% of that is frozen in the form of glacial ice. So a very, very small fraction of all of the water on Earth is actually ready for us to drink without having to do something to it. So water is a very scarce resource when you think about what percentage is available to what quantity is on Earth. The atmosphere is made up of all of the air surrounding Earth. So this consists of 5 unique layers, and the atmosphere reaches up to 560 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. It's primarily made up of nitrogen, 78% nitrogen, and nitrogen is what we call an inert gas, so it doesn't react with anything, doesn't really do a great deal. And the other percentage is about 21% of oxygen, which as we know is really important for us to breathe, and there's a lot of other small components in very, very small quantities. So you can see on this pie chart here we have our nitrogen, the oxygen, and every other gas particle or element that we find in the atmosphere makes up this 1%. Sphere interactions are really important. So it's important to know that each of those 4 spheres we've talked about in this lesson are not independent. So they are constantly interacting with each other, and they have a huge effect on one another as well. So it's important to understand that the others are all interlinked. So we cannot have one solely without the other, and the effect that one has on the other can be quite significant. So they're all in a very sort of sensitive balance. An example of this is when it rains, which is the hydrosphere. This falls from the clouds in the atmosphere to the ground, which makes up the lithosphere, and this forms streams and rivers that provide the drinking water for the wildlife and the humans, as well as water for the plants, which is the biosphere. So they're all interconnected between each other. Another example is that rivers erode banks, which is the geosphere, and it can uproot plants, being the biosphere, on those riverbanks. Another example is flooding rivers, which is the hydrosphere. They can wash away the soil, being the geosphere. So the next task is to have a look at this picture here of a coastline, and I want you to try and suggest as many interactions as possible between the geosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere from this picture in 5 minutes. So you can write these down if you want, or try and think about them in your head, but as many as you can think of in 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Let's have a look at some possible answers that you could have used within this. So the things that I've suggested are things like waves crashing into the cliffs, causing the upper portions of the rocks to collapse. So that's the link between the hydrosphere and the geosphere. We could have things like the wave action carries sand to the rocks and the shoreline, again, between the two. Water evaporating from the ocean into the atmosphere. Water vapor condensing to form clouds. Clouds producing rain. Rainwater needed for plant growth. Plant roots help stabilize the soil. The vegetation takes up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and it can release oxygen. The vegetation also adds nutrients into the soil. The ocean's a habitat for microscopic life, the plants, the fish, the birds and the mammals. The wind can generate waves in the atmosphere, as well as in the hydrosphere, and the wind may blow away soil in exposed locations. And lastly, the oceans absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So all of these are significant interactions between all of the spheres. From here, use your dystopian future planning document and add notes to your dystopia in terms of the state of the spheres as it is in your dystopian timeline, and talk about how they would then interact with one another. Or you could also include a factor as to what led to your dystopian future based on those spheres. So what happened to each of the spheres that has helped create your dystopia, or something along those lines. So we're linking the science of this lesson back into your dystopia to try and provide like a scientific justification for how we got to that point. And I'll see you next lesson.